So, please welcome Johannes Klick with how to use internet scans and passive measurements to analyze Russian attacks and their impact in Ukraine.
Hello, welcome. My name is Johannes Klick. I'm here for talking to you about how to use internet scans and massive and passive measurements to analyze Russian attacks and the impact in Ukraine. I'm CEO and co-founder of Alphastrike Labs. It's a company about which does scanning whole the day the internet, and then we do also a lot of research. Have also published last Chaos Communication Camp. I have published here a talk how to set up a search engine and which ways you can globally scan the internet several times. And now we use much more of this data for making advanced research. So, but before we start with the Russian attacks and how we can measure the impact using global internet scans, I'm here more also to talk about why the resilience of the Ukraine in terms of internet is so high. So at first it's really sad that the power of the beamer is not that high. I hope you can see something. Interesting point is that when we talk about Ukraine, we can see that approximate 55% of all end users in Ukraine are served by very small ISPs. So we can see this there in a circle. We can see that like 45% are served by larger ISPs, which serve more than 1% of the whole end clients. But 55% of all end clients in Ukraine are served by an ISP that is managing less than 1% of the whole clients in Ukraine. When you compare it to Germany, on the next slide, we can see that in Germany, in comparison to that, only 18% of end users are managed by very small ISPs, less than 1%. So we can see that in Ukraine we have much more diversity in terms of small ISPs. They are each connected to each other, and when one ISP has maybe no power or maybe falls out, the traffic can go route through another ISP, and this makes it much more resilient. Here in Germany we have approximately 1/3 of all end clients are on Deutsche Telekom, the another third is on Vodafone. This means at least when one of these ISPs get knocked out by somehow of a strike, we will have big troubles here in Germany. And we are not thinking, the next point is also the day kicks, right? That's also a point. But in Ukraine, they have a huge amount of very small ISPs serving approximate half of the whole end clients we have there. And this makes the internet itself in Ukraine very robust compared to Western countries. Before I explain about the results we have, I just want to tell something about how we collected the data. So what we are our own internet service provider. We have our two different /22s. This means over 2,000 different IP addresses, which we use for internet scanning. This means we are scanning the internet, and each time when we connect to a new system, we use a new IP address. And this leads to the fact that we, like half an hour, we visit with the same address, the same network. So each 30 minutes. This gives us a very good opportunity to be under the radar of a lot of intrusion detection systems and prevents a lot of blocking. Our stuff has been developed in a free university of Berlin, financed by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in former times. This was around 14 to 15, 17. Then we founded out of that a company and did some cool, interesting stuff. And now we are coming to the point that when we are doing all the time the internet scans and see, okay, where are the clients, we have seen, especially in the Ukraine, when the war started, that a lot of clients' availability dropped. And we said, okay, that's very interesting. We need to investigate it because it makes sense when maybe a lot of power outage we have, and we know that the Russians have attacked a lot of critical infrastructure in the Ukraine. Then where there's no power, there's also a high chance that you have no internet because also routers and so on need a lot of power, right? And especially in the end, in the small office, home office, in the from the people, whereas not the small routers, no power, there will be also no internet. That is why we have taken as base reference for our analysis October 21, which is approximate, so half a year before the Russians started their attacks, as a reference and said, okay, this amount of servers we have seen is the 100%, the baseline, and then we have seen how are the services behaving when the Russians started their attack. And here we see the first chart. I hope you can see it somehow. On the left, we have started by 100% for different protocols, for HTTPS, SSH, HTTP hosts, DNS hosts, SMTP hosts. And we can see in the middle of the chart that there's approximately the end of February, beginning of March 22, where the red arrow is somehow seeable. We can see there's a huge drop in service availability. This is here, for instance, this is a special area of Ukraine. This is in the northeast Ukraine. This is northeast also from Kiev. This is the region where, when we have here Chernihiv, this is the oblast of Kiev, got invaded via Belarus and via Russia and got occupied by approximately 70%. And we can see that during the occupation, a lot of services in that area went down, especially the web services and also the mail services. But one service still was very steady. This was DNS. And this was somewhere we thought, okay, that's very interesting. We can see a lot of services drop by approximately 60%, but only DNS is quite still stable. When we compare now, especially the results from the beginning of March with the beginning of April, we can see that in the beginning of April, remember, the Russians had a lot of logistic problems. They needed to retreat, going back to Belarus, etc., and then they released Kiev, right? And then we can see the services are going up again. So some people said that oh, maybe they have just fixed the infrastructure and then the services go up, right? But we see that all the time DNS is very steady. We have talked to some companies that have third-party providers based in Ukraine, and they told us that before the Russians have invaded them, they have shut down the system for data integrity protection and also data theft protection, right? And that's why they have brought down their servers, but DNS was still active, because if you have ever tried to boot up a whole AD Windows infrastructure without DNS, it's not possible, right? That is the last core services you will remain, and that is why we see that we have seen DNS was quite steady and all other services went down by 60%, and after the Russians retreated and went back to their country, to Belarus, it went up again, right? This was very interesting. We have seen this kind of behavior and seen, okay, we need to now make more intense scans on an hourly basis to understand and to see, maybe we can also see where some Russian rockets attack some power plants, and if can maybe see if in that region we can see that a lot of servers are also going down and going up after some hours when the power is up again. And this I will show that. Here we can see also a very special case, that is Mariupol. You can maybe see we have also set 100%. For all protocols, and then for all protocols it goes down by 90%, right? Mariupol is a city, it's very close to a city that got attacked very hard, very first by a lot of critical airstrikes and so on. On the right side, you could normally see data from the European Space Administration. They have done some radar scans and have seen that approximately 90% of all buildings are now like 10 up to 50 meters lower than before, because they got completely destroyed, right? And using our internet scans, we can also see that approximately 90% of all network services we have identified in that region are also not existing anymore since the beginning of the invasions and the attacks of the Russians. This means we could also, just sitting here in Berlin, scanning from our IP addresses, we can just use it like a radar, looking if you're up, are you up, are you up, oh no, you're down. Then we can see that 90% of all service in Mariupol went down like in the first 2 weeks of the attacks by the Russians, and 90% are not still available anymore. And this shows us that also for a long time, for at least 3 months, this shows us that you can use internet scans for use some kind of battle damage assessment to see how big is the attack and how big is the in the end the result of the attack also for the region. This information is, for instance, important for when you are the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and you support some NGOs, for instance, right? Then it would be very interesting to see how big is the grade of destructions in a certain area, and you can use this kind of information for rough estimation. So what we then did is that we said, okay, we have selected 400,000 static IP addresses in Ukraine. It's like having vantage points for measuring, and then we have scanned these 400,000 static IP addresses every 4 hours, just for looking where in a certain region services are going up or going down. Very important. Static is very important because if you use dynamic IP addresses are very often up or down because people switch off their mobile router or get a new IP address, whatever. That is why we have chosen static IP addresses. And as you can remember, we know that especially in October 2022, this was the first big attack of the Russians against the critical infrastructure of the Ukraine. A lot of reports also from Reuters has shown this was the first well-known Russian attack against the critical infrastructure. And then we have chosen open source intelligence. Here on the right side, you can see somehow a map from Wikipedia, which has collected tons of reports from social medias and also from newspapers where in a certain region Russians have attacked and where we have received a power outage in that region. And the interesting point is that in the end, in all regions where we have seen that the open source intelligence says, or here the social media says there was a power outage, we can also see that we have a drop in our scans. So for instance, here we can see on the map on Chernihiv, which is in northeast, this is a country which got not this is an oblast, like a state of the Ukraine, which got not directly hit, also received not a power outage, but all surrounding states of or oblasts of Chernihiv have received power outages. And we can also see this in the data on the right side. When you can see a small drop, this is a drop we can see on the power outages in Chernihiv because all the border regions also received a power loss. And for making showing you that also the opposite also works very well, we can see that in Odessa, which is in the southwest of Ukraine, we can see there was no power outage given by the social media and in other newspapers, and there we can see in the data a quite steady line on the availability of the network services. Now we are going directly to Sumy, which is an oblast which received a bigger power outage, and there we can see here on the right side a big drop by approximate 90 up to 80% across all protocols. Right? When we remember, we have seen the Chernihiv first stuff. We have seen there was still DNS was still running. In that case, we can see that HTTP, SSH, HTTPS and DNS, all services went down exactly at the moment as the social media also reports there has been Russian attacks into the critical infrastructure and also says there was a power outage. And we can just say, okay, yes, we can also measure that. This is also, and we can also estimate, here we can see the power drop, and we can just estimate that the power outage was around 12 hours. So we say when approximately 80% of all services are up again, we say the power outage is over, right? There we can very good see, we can see like after 12 hours, 80% are reached, and then they took like 3 further days to get up to the 100%, right? And that is very interesting. It's also when you're an NGO, it's very interesting to understand how many fuel I need to take for covering these power outage time, for instance, right? Or how to maybe what kind of turbines energy turbines do Ukraine need, and so on. So this is very interesting data because you can just on a social media you can just see there was some kind of power outage, but you can't hard measure how long it is. And here we have very good qualified data for doing that. So this data here was for Sumy. We can also see this for Poltava. Poltava is the same. We can see here on the right side a drop across all protocols, and also here this time this was 8 hours, but it was not that big. It was approximately only by 40% the drop. We can also see this here for Ternopil. There was a first strike on the night from the 6th to the 7th October, and also on the 10th October we can see also a bigger drop, and then what's very interesting, we can see here they have been fighting really, really long for getting up to the 100%, because at first they just went to the 80% and then we get up and they get down, etc. You can see that the energy grid was very unstable for at least 3 up to 4 days. So here we have just a table which shows us where the power outage has been detected by the open source and social media, and what our results is showing. And we have we can see that very often when we have power outage detected, we also our mechanism is detected in it, or the algorithm, and we did a Pearson correlation coefficient analysis, and we got a strong correlation because we got a result from 0.74, which indicates a strong correlation using our methodology for detecting power outages in Ukraine. Has a strong correlation to the open source and social media reports. So this means that the algorithm and the technology is working, and it's very interesting. So now we can see the next, approximately half a year later, on the 9th of March, the Russians attacked again the critical infrastructure of the Ukraine. And the very interesting point is then we measured it again, and this time we can see, for instance, here for sorry for that name, but Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, there was only a small power outage, like 20% for 8 hours. We can also see this here for Kivororod, which was also a very small power outage, like 40%, only for 8 hours. So when we now go further and investigated it, we understand we have seen here that on the October the power outage was every time like 80% for 12 up to 15 hours, and then it took like 3 days. They recovered completely to 100%. But half a year later, the Russian attacks have not such big impact, because here we can see power outages now only maximum 80%, very close to the 100%, and then it's easier. I talked to some Ukrainian guys and they said yes, because we learned to deal with that. A lot of Ukraine's civilian people have now small energy turbines, generators, and so on, and they self-power them for the time of the for the outage. We have also the United States have provided very big power generators, huge turbines like big cars that are able to distribute power for a whole district of a city. So they distributed the power supply of the Ukraine using mobile generators, the civilians on their own, and also by the government, supported by the Germans and the United States. And we can see in our measurements that the impact of the power outages are much lower than before, because we can see it's not over the 50%. Before we had like 80-90%, now it's maximum 50%. And also the time of the power outages has decreased by 50%. Because we now have only like 8 hours up to the 100%. That's very interesting to see that the Russian attacks against the critical power grid is less efficient than before in October. And that is measurable by internet scans. This is so fascinating, right? That you can sit here and see the data and analyze it from home, not being there, but you can make very interesting research about these kind of topics. Okay, now we are also looking for the Russian control, right? So we have here Zaporozhye, which is under Russian control, and we can see that the power attacks against Zaporozhye, against the Russian-controlled area, has no impact. So we can see that the Russians are not attacking their own region, right? They are not impacted by their own attacks, because there's also cross-check you have to do, right? Maybe there's some general failure in my methodology, but this is very interesting to see that the Russians are all the time steady in their controlled area, and that they attack only the Ukraine power grid system, and they do not impact themselves. Okay. This was about kinetic strike detection, and to understand how you can use internet scans for detection and to analyze it. Now we are going to more presumably Russian attacks. So very interesting is we have Kherson. Kherson is a city which was very heavily contested, and which went under control in the end of March and April under the Russians. And what we can see here is the BGP dependency graph. This means we can see here from Kherson Telecom, which is an ISP, an internet service provider of Kherson. We can see where do they give, who is the main upstream provider of Kherson Telecom, right? So this means when you surf on your network, where is the traffic for Kherson Telecom clients going through? And here we can see it was taken by Ucomline. Ucomline was the upstream provider of Kherson Telecom. And in the beginning of May, in the 1st May, we can see there is a switch. There's a switch that they have given 100% of their traffic to Ucomline, which is Ukraine ISP, and then there was a switch to Miranda AS, Miranda Autonomous System. So who is Miranda? Just looking, Miranda Media Limited is the ISP, is the new upstream provider of Kherson Telecom in the 1st of May. There was a change on the BGP data. Very interesting, 1st of May is also a holiday in Ukraine, right? Day of Labor. And we can see Miranda Limited is an ISP which has been founded in 2014 on the Crimea. Interesting, right? And when we see also in the RIPE data, they state it's in Crimea and belongs to the Russian Federation. So we see it looks like a Russian ISP. Doing some more investigation, we can see here that also Miranda Limited is responsible for the Internet sea cable that connected Crimea and Russia mainland, right? And very interesting point is that this Internet cable was finished in 2014, very close to the invasion to Crimea, and this Internet cable was also provided by a Chinese cable layer called Yingong 1. Right? Isn't it fascinating to understand these political behaviors behind that? So we have here clearly a Russian ISP, an ISP that is also operating a sea cable connecting Crimea and Russian mainland, and so it makes totally sense that they are the new upstream provider of Kherson Telecom, a city they have invaded. And very interesting is that you can see later, there was on the 4th of May, we can see there's somehow back switch to data group. So going back to an Ukraine ISP. And then there's also a New York Times report which says, yes, very important, a lot of different reports, especially in Kherson. Russian people arrived, Russian soldiers arrived and tried to get control about the internet infrastructure and also telecommunication companies. So this time here, in the first time of war, we can really see that the internet as a part of critical infrastructure is also a tactical objective, obviously, right? So Russians came and say, please switch off your routes going to Miranda AS. That's how it's working. And the interesting point is that we can see, so here we can see that on the 4th of May there was switchback to the Ukraine ISP, and it looks like then they used maybe more forces, or so they're different. There's a huge topic on the Facebook channel of Kherson Telecom where the CEO says, yes, there was no connection, I was not forced by the Russians, but I thought it's better to use the Russian internet than the Ukrainian because it's more stable, and so on, right? So, but it's very hard to say here from Germany what's really true. But we can see that in the end of May, the 31 May, we can see since November 2022, it was all the time Miranda AS was the primary upstream provider of Kherson Telecom. And then we can remember that in the 9th November, the Russians retreated from Kherson, they went back. And the interesting is we can also see this in the BGP data, because exactly to the 9th November, Kherson Telecom has no upstream provider anymore. The Russians have cut the lines and then they moved away from Kherson, right? And this is also seeable by the BGP data. Very interesting is Kherson Telecom went never up again. They are now completely away. And I have heard some rumors that the CEO of Kherson Telecom went also in prison or gets accused, but this is still some social media stuff, right? It's very hard to prove the truth. We can just see here the data on the BGP, and we can see that the Russians have somehow try to get the control about the upstream of Kherson Telecom. In the end of May, they have received the control. All traffic went through Kherson Telecom. It's very important because for censorship, of course, you can also identify maybe partisan troops, try to communicate using the internet, whatever. And then when they retreated from Kherson, the lines got cut and we can see no connection anymore for Kherson Telecom. So this was the second part. Now we are coming to the third part of the talk. We also operate a third /22 just as a black sensor network. It's on a name from a different company. And the black sensor network, we call it internally the cyber echelon, right? This means it's just collecting the data. Just when you make some ping probe, some TCP SYN traffic, whatever, it's a sinkhole. It's just recording all the data and enriches the data. Who is connecting? What is the autonomous system from the IP addresses that get sent from, and so on. But you will never receive an answer from this black hole network. Using this, we can also understand how are people scanning, and if maybe there's a new RDP vulnerability, for instance, we can use this kind of technology to see who is scanning for new RDP ports or for new vulnerabilities and so on. That is for why we have this sensor network. But the interesting point is that we have approximately 116 million packets per day, and over 90% of all the data is TCP data we receive, 5% UDP data, 3% ICMP pings. So, and the interesting point here is that we can see here on the left, we can see nothing, but I will now explain the chart, okay? So imagine it's like that, and then we have time of war, and then immediate increase of the TCP packets we receive from the Ukraine. So suddenly this war begins, and we receive a lot of traffic from the Ukraine on our sensor network. And that's very interesting. We thought, why? So when we try to understand TCP handshake, normally you send a SYN, you get a SYN ACK back, then you send an ACK, connection established, layer 4 communication very easily. And then we have looked what kind of packets do we receive. And then we have seen we receive SYN ACK packets. So this means we receive packets from server. They say, yes, it's okay that you try to connect to me. I want to set up a connection also to you, right? It makes no sense because we have a black hole sensor network. We have never sent some kind of connection requests. So why do we receive SYN ACK communication? And then we have thought about it and said, okay, makes sense. Somebody is spoofing randomly IP addresses, sending it out against Ukraine targets, and then Ukraine targets are responding with SYN ACK packets back to our sensor network, because when you randomly spoof IP addresses, you will also randomly spoof some IP addresses of our black hole sensor networks. We have 1,000 IP addresses. There will be some, when you send tons of packets, there's a very good chance that you will also spoof some of our IP addresses. So just to illustrate it, the attacker is sending spoofed SYN packets to the Ukraine victim, and the victim is replying with SYN ACK packets, and some of the SYN ACK packets are also hitting our sensor network. And in that way, we can identify who is the victim of the DDoS attack, right? So we can see that, especially in the beginning of April. So on a chart you can't see here, but you have to imagine now. We can see that in the beginning of April, the 1st April, there's a high spike up to the end of May, and then is anything anymore, right? So somebody has somehow fired a DDoS attack against Ukraine server, and in that case we have looking who is the IP address that's sending us the SYN ACK packet. It was President Gov.ua. Right? So somebody DDoSed President Gov.ua by randomly spoofing IP addresses, and it's very easy to do that. And it's also hard to fight against this kind of traffic. And you just rent some bulletproof hoster which allows TCP IP spoofing, and then you can, I don't know, for 500 euros you can also get a 10 gigabit connection, and then you try to fire against it. The problem is against this kind of traffic is it's very hard. It's not that you receive DDoS traffic from a certain autonomous system, and then it's very hard to block because you receive completely different packets from a lot of different ISPs because they randomly spoof the IP addresses. But the other point on this kind of attackers, you have to buy a lot of bandwidth. Normally, there was also another talk today, 2 hours before. Very often DDoS attacks are also executed that you try to identify a multiplier like DNS or NTP server. You send traffic and they send a 10 or 20 times amount back to the victim. In that case here, we have people that are spoofing IP addresses and sending it directly to the victim, and the victim is replying somehow to us because they also spoofed our IP addresses, and we can see that exactly in the beginning of April, 1st April, they started the attack, and the end of April, they finished. And then we can also see that in the beginning of May, they started the attack, wending up, going down the end of May, and then exact in the beginning on June, they are starting the attack, and the end of June they stopped. So we can really see a very good pattern on these kind of Russian attacks. It's in the beginning of the month, it looks like somebody has paid maybe somebody for doing something, and then starting on the 1st of May, yes sir, we are starting on the 1st of May, you know. So it makes no sense that you really start in the exactly the beginning of the month your DDoS attacks. So that's it's like a freelancer hacker would never work like that, right? So starting exactly on the 1st of the month. Yeah, very interesting to see that. So the second attack we have investigated here on the beginning of June and the beginning of July was booking Gov.ua. This is a portal where you can book your train stuff, where you can get your tickets, where you can travel around Ukraine, which is also important for troop movements, because also the Russian soldiers move by train, of course, when they go home for some stuff and so on. And so we can also see they have attacked the presidential website and also the critical infrastructure, the train system, the booking system. Okay, so now putting stuff in a nutshell, we can use internet scans combined with open source intelligence data and also satellite imagery. We remember on the European Space Administration picture of Mariupol, and we can also to make strong correlations for various events in the Ukraine, in the Ukraine-Russian conflict. We can use very intense internet scans, like we have done in the scanning the Ukraine, the static server, every 4 hours, to measure the impact of kinetic attacks by the Russians, or to use it for some kind of better damage assessment to see how efficient are the Russian attacks. And we can also, this is also another point, imagine that somebody on social media says a huge nuclear bomb or whatever has exploded somewhere. You could also use these kind of scans to make some kind of fake news detection, because if you have really, really large damage event somewhere, you could use these internet scans also to verify these kind of information. Are they really strongly hit? Is there really a large bombing, whatever? Then we would see that in our data. So you could also use this kind of approach for fake news detection in the end, or for verification. We have also learned that the Ukraine internet consists of much more small ISPs compared to the Germany. They are much more resilient because more than 50% of the end clients are served by very small ISPs that serve less than 1% of the whole clients. We can use the BGP data to understand who is trying to capture critical infrastructure, especially communication infrastructure, and to route traffic through their own country for censorship, for instance. And we have also learned that we can use the blackhole sensor network for understanding who is the victim in the Ukraine for a certain type of DDoS attacks. And we have also seen that in the DDoS attacks we have investigated, there is some kind of campaigning, because the attacks started every time on the 1st of the month and ended in the end of the month, which shows us this is some kind of foreign cyber campaign maybe behind it. Okay, so this was my talk. I thank you very much for your attention. I know it was very hot. And
we do have a few minutes for questions. Please line up at the microphone.
Countries in Europe are divided approximately equally right now in terms of which ones require registration of identity to obtain SIM cards and those that don't. The Russo-Ukrainian war is between two powers on opposite ends of this spectrum. In Ukraine, no registration is required. In the Russian Federation, it is. Well, this is less relevant now as the Russian troops retreat. Early in the war, Russian troops were obtaining Ukrainian SIM cards through looting and other measures. That enabled them to stay in touch and coordinate because they were given inadequate radio signals equipment. And one of the interesting questions at the time was how open source, foreign open source intelligence operatives or the Ukrainian government could try to determine which cellular signals to intercept or disrupt. Given that no registration was available, is this a problem you've encountered? Or how would you recommend as a strategy in this theoretical scenario?
Wow, so mobile network communications was not part of my talk. It's a very good question, but in the end, I'm not an expert for the mobile network communication. I can just say from a network perspective that the mobile communications are mostly behind the network address translation and NAT, and that you can't reach them via the scans very often. So that's why they are out of my scope, because I cannot scan them, right? So that's why I'm not dealing about. I'm sorry, I have no good question, ma'am. It's not my subject.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned this provider in Kherson, which is now gone. Do you have any indication what the clients of this provider are now doing? Have they switched to another one? Did you see any increase in another ISP?
Good question. This is a very interesting point. We have not investigated that, but if you maybe give me later a card or contact information, we can do this, and I can send you this. A very good point. So very often they have their own ranges and they belong to the RIPE, and I think that the IP addresses are now dead until they get released by the RIPE again, because of course. So that's what I would think now. But maybe we can identify some HTTPS certificates and can see where these servers have maybe moved to another ISP. It's a very good idea. We can investigate it. Very good point. Good idea.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask about the coordination. Like you scan like 400,000 IPs on Ukraine every 4 hours,
yes.
right? Did you have any kind of coordination with them? Because it's a war, right? So I imagine from the other side they are trying to defend, and then you're just hitting their things. And not only you, but like all the other companies, right? So did you do any coordinations like these are our IPs, like we are doing this? Or?
So it's so when you, for instance, when you go when you look who is the IP address who's scanning, you can see it's Alpha Strike Lab, it's ResearchNet. You have an abuse address. When you email to the abuse address, you get a complete answer about the research project we are doing. Technically, it's like every 4 hours, 1 packet per system. It's nothing, right? So it's. Yeah, but the traffic we issue is very. It's just a SYN packet on HTTP on HTTPS. It's really. Under the backscatter of all scanning we have all the time. So it's like there's some kind of background noise all the time on the internet. So everybody is scanning everybody like that. And this 1 packet every 4 hours, they are not even identifying it, you know. So we got no complaints on from Ukraine. So at that point it's like there was no coordination because there was no impact in the end, and it was also predicted by us there will be no impact. Okay.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I would assume that especially owners of static IP addresses have a quite professional hardware setup containing uninterruptible power supply of some sort. So is it really that 4 hours accurate what you showed off, or might there be a heavy impact because they might be able to power up from scratch even in the beginning of the war?
You're from Germany, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Very typical, because that every 24 hours you get a new IP address is a very typical German stuff, right? So especially when you think on cable modems, you have even now in Germany very often static IP addresses. So I have also static IP address at my home. So and especially when you go abroad, having static IP addresses on a broadband connection, it's very usual in the foreign countries. So yes, of course, it's more likely that you have maybe more professional setup, because each professional setup will have a static IP address. But compared to like standard DSL connections here in Germany, and even they have now more than 24 hours a static IP address. Yes, there could be a somehow small shift that will be more professional, and we receive lower or maybe not that good results. But when this effect would be really there, then we wouldn't have seen like 90% power loss on the attacks in October, right? And because we have seen that, I would say this is not a factor that impacts our result very much, because the special equipment could be maximum 10% of our results, because we have seen a drop on 90%, and the 10% remaining have maybe professional equipment. Yes, sure.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was wondering whether you have any insight in the type of devices or the locality of the static IPs you're measuring. So is it a representative sample of the Ukrainian internet infrastructure? Or, yeah.
Yes, so what we have done is we have looked for ISPs. So we have seen that we have really, from all ISPs, a good sample, right? And from all prefixes and so on. So this, it's not like we have 400,000 IP addresses from like 2 ISPs. That's something, of course, we have checked. And that's a very good distribution across all ISPs and also across all locations in Ukraine. So, yep, sure. Thank you very much. Very good question.
Hi, question. Previous reports on scanning the infrastructure send the reports to the Ukrainian government for approval before publishing. Did you ask them before publishing if you can?
So what we have done is I was on a conference from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Germany, and there I have met the Vice Deputy for the Ministry of Communication and IT, something like that. And I talked to him, and he said, "Oh, very interesting data. Please send it to me." Right? So there was not for him it was not like it's very sensitive data or something like that. And from our perspective, I'm here in Germany, and we have freedom of research. And when I found out these very interesting results, I want to publish it and to explain to people that you can use these very interesting types of data and this internet scanning stuff also to understand what goes up in the Ukraine, also to fight against fake news and some other stuff, right? That's so. But in the end, there was no coordination because how you I cannot just pick up a phone and say, "Hi, I'm Johannes Klick. I want to talk with the vice president, whatever, and I want to internet scan it. Is okay for you?" That's not how it's working, right? It's like, I will get in a spam and then I wait for 2 hours and then it was it, right? So that's, but nobody was complaining and so yeah, there's a war, of course, yes, and they have been very thankful for the insights because they have not been aware that we could have been able to measure that the second Russian attacks are less powerful than the first wave we have seen. So in the end, all Ukrainian guys I have talked to, they have been very thankful for these very interesting insights and to prove that they have been more resilient against the Russian attacks. That was all feedback I have received all the time.
Thank you so much for your research. I'm wondering, are you able to see Starlink devices? Are you able to see people move to satellite internet, or is this something that you're blind to?
So I have not investigated that. So when you Starlink, when you have a device that it depends. I have not investigated. When they have IP addresses and no network behind it, you will have direct contact to these networks. But very often satellite networks and other stuff is netted or like mobile communications. But you have also every time the opportunity to have M2M connections, machine-to-machine connections, static IP addresses. I don't know what the exact setup is. I have not investigated Starlink because a lot of other researchers concentrating on Starlink and what's going up in Ukraine. And I wanted to make other stuff in the end. But it's still interesting, so I can look up if we maybe find something, and if I find no connection to Starlink, I would highly bet that they have a network address translation. Okay, thank you. Good question.
Thank you, Johannes Klick.
Thanks.